Okay, this is going to be a video about doing your very first Zentangle. So this is just a very small one. It's just my warm-up or my practice before we jump into a larger finished work. So don't worry if you make lots of mistakes. That's why we're doing a warm-up, and also don't worry about finishing this one. You just need to kind of get the hang of things and make your big mistakes before you do one that's going to be a little more polished. So I'm going to follow basically the directions that are given on the Zentangle website, but maybe modify them a little bit too. So first they tell us to express gratitude. So remember, this is a meditation and it should be relaxing and fun. The next step is to add corner dots. So what we're going to do with these is create a border or a frame. So notice I didn't put these very close to the corners. I'm leaving plenty of extra room. You should have at the end a kind of border that's like about a ½ inch wide. If in doubt, put those dots a little farther in than you think you need to. Then they're going to have you do what they call a, what do they call this? Never mind, forget that part. I'm connecting these, but notice I don't have to use straight lines. I highly encourage you to create weird and exciting lines which will make weird and exciting shapes once we connect them. Okay, so the second part of this, and I should say I'm using an HB pencil. That's the lightest I've given you. You could also just use your normal number 2 pencil, like my little Day of the Dead pencil here. Either is fine. The next thing that they have you do is add a string. So I can do that really simply by just breaking the space in half, or I can do one where I get a little fancier. Okay, so I'm going to do a different kind of string, and notice I've also made a different kind of border. So instead of starting with my corner dots, I decided I wanted a rounder border. You can really do any shape you want for that kind of overall frame or border. So now I'm going to do my string, and I'm going to let it touch the sides of my border if I want. The main thing with a string is you're creating big spaces. You're breaking your overall frame into big spaces. So since my frame reminded me of a butterfly, I'm giving my butterfly kind of a cartoony body. And then I could continue to break things down. I could create strings there. And so a string is just going to break whatever your Zentangle is into some large spaces. And that brings me to some of my rules or steps or tips or suggestions, whatever you want to call them, for doing Zentangles. And once you've done those 2 steps of doing your border and then doing your string, however you wanted your string to look, the next step that they give you on the official Zentangle website is to tangle. And they recommend doing that in a pen, and they just describe that as a series of repeated shapes or lines, and they describe it as being like dancing. It's so really you're doodling is what you're doing when you're tangling. Use lots of repetition. And they do suggest using a pen so that you're not getting super caught up in your head or worried about mistakes. That said, I have a few additional tips and suggestions. So after doing the frame and the board and the string, then we want to continue to do big and medium shapes. So I could jump right in with my pen. I might actually use my pencil for a little bit longer. So I'm doing big and medium shapes. So we're going to work opposite of that, big to small. So all of these, I would say, are kind of medium or large within that overall pattern. And I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna keep doing that on the other side. So I'm using repetition, so these shapes are all sort of similar. I'm letting them overlap one another, so the way that they appear to touch one another makes them look like they're overlapping. I could even, if I wanted to, I could let them overlap this border. So maybe I'll do that. And that's why I'm working in pencil right now, so I can make this shape look like it goes in front of the border. All right, and I'll do something similar on the other side, but maybe also a little bit different. So instead of organic shapes, this time I'll use geometric shapes. Actually, I'm not great at geometric shapes, so these are almost geometric. They're almost triangles. That's what I'm going for anyway. And again, I'm having them overlap one another. I'm having them go right up to the borders and even over the borders. So if you're following along with the video, I encourage you to not copy what I'm doing exactly, but follow the same steps, follow my tips, but give it your own spin, do your own shapes. So I can keep going, and I'm going to keep going with my triangle pattern, even outside the border. Maybe I'll do a little bit more. And some of these I'm sort of cutting off the tip to, again, give it that illusion that it's going behind, that it's overlapping. Other things that you can do with this, I can also decorate the border. I'm going to switch to my pen because I don't want you to forget that really this is going to be in pen. And I have a secret weapon here. So I picked up my fine liner, which I love for this. I also love my ballpoint pen, and this is a very special ballpoint pen. This one is erasable, and you can tell it's erasable because it comes with its own eraser. And I do have a bunch of these. I just don't have enough to put in every art kit. So feel free to borrow these in class. You just can't take them home because I don't have enough if you do that. But you can order these online on Amazon. All you do is search erasable ballpoint pen. Okay, so if I'm worried about making mistakes or wanting to go back and make things that I can then make overlap one another, I could use this. So I'm inking everything that I just did. So inking means going over it with ink. That's adding contrast and makes it look more finished. And I can use some of these same shapes, so repetition. That is definitely the name of the game here. Okay, I'm actually going to switch to my fine liner because I like my fine liner. It gives me even more contrast. And if I'm feeling pretty confident with these, why not? And I do encourage you to give it a try. So part of my instructions to you are to hide mistakes, okay? So yes, you're trying to avoid mistakes, but don't try to avoid them so hard that you're giving yourself an ulcer or a tummy ache. So really, again, this should be a fun project. It should be a meditation. It should be relaxing. And if you're worried that you're going to make a mistake, it is hard to relax. So my advice is, instead of worrying too much about whether you're going to make a mistake or working too hard, yes, there is a too hard, there is a right amount of working to avoid mistakes, and then there's too hard. So instead of working too hard to avoid mistakes, we're going to learn to hide our mistakes and make them look intentional. All right, and if there's some places, though, that I don't really know, maybe I do want to make some more things, a little more, less permanent, so I could use more overlapping. Then maybe I'll do some areas in my erasable pen. So you can see the difference. The erasable pen, it's nice if you want a lighter line, but if you want a bolder look, which usually we do in Zentangles, you don't want to necessarily just use your ballpoint pen. And I think the erasable pen is even a little bit lighter maybe than the regular ballpoint pen. So I am inking everything. I'm also making little changes as I go. So if you're going to work in pencil, you might as well take advantage of that. And if you see something that you're like, oh, maybe I can do something a little more fun, just change it as you go. And then later on, I can go back in and erase those pencil lines. Don't want to erase my erasable ballpoint pen though by accident. So I'm using my my little small eraser and I'm holding it in my hand. Okay, so I did my my borders. I did my big and medium shapes. I'm inking everything. Notice when I want things to overlap, I have to totally connect them. If I don't quite go up to the line, then I would go back in and fix that. I could even switch pens if I'm not sure that I can get it just right with this pen, which is a little bolder. I could even switch to maybe the more delicate ballpoint pen. All right, so I did ink everything that I wanted to keep. All right, and it's looking pretty cool already. So then our next phase is to add more details. So our details can start getting smaller. We've got really big shapes, we've got medium shapes, so we can keep going. We want to add small shapes and then maybe even extra small, tiny. All right, I want to definitely do some overlapping. So one thing that I could do, I'm going to create some things. I'm going to switch because I know I'm going to do overlapping. Some details maybe that go behind these other things. I like to create double lines sometimes that I think of as ribbons. I was just thinking, oh, I wish I could go from one to the other. But since I did make that permanent, it's a little bit harder. Maybe I could still do it though. I'm going to think of ways that I could make this cross actually. I'm going to switch this. Okay. So I'm going to, what if I made this line a shape instead? And then I can have this ribbon go underneath it. All right, and notice how I drew right through there. That's why I'm drawing in pencil, because then I can go back and erase, and it can make it easier to kind of visualize where you want things overlapping. So if I draw right through here, I can still then erase that. Okay, so I'm going to ink this to make it maybe a little bit clearer what I'm doing. All right, so whenever I'm overlapping like this, I'm adding a sense of form and depth. So even though this project is on the simpler side, using shape, using line, really just kind of getting the hang of materials and craftsmanship, we can still already kind of make things a little more fun and interesting and sophisticated looking by adding form and depth. And you may have noticed that in the online Zentangle video, they were doing that, which is why some of you were like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. Yes, you can do Zentangle, but also, yes, the more you learn and the more you practice, the better your Zentangles will get. That's just a fact of life. with anything. All right, so I wanted that to go under here. I continued it a little bit. This is going under here. I'm going to finish inking this over here. And I made this erasable. What if, so my idea with this is, what if I had more overlapping happening with this? So maybe I can take advantage of that and have, okay, this is going to go under and then appear to come out the other side. Look at that. So I stopped it here because I know I can erase. I can erase that little line there. And then when I ink it, it can appear to go through that triangular shape. So that was why I did leave some of my things in the erasable ink. All right, so I keep going with this. I really liked that. That was super fun. So maybe I'll do that again over here. All right, and I'm going to draw in pencil so I can really all right, and I'm already thinking this ribbon is like a line, right? It's like a double line. I'm thinking about line variety. So I can make that taper. All right. So I'm having that go over. This part is erasable. So I'm going to erase that little part. And I will say this erasable ink, the longer it sits, it doesn't actually erase anymore. So that might not erase all the way. That is a time when I could use my white gel pen. Now, one thing to watch out for, if you use your white gel pen over fresh ink, it may not work as well and it may sort of turn grayish. So my suggestion is, one, maybe wait a minute before you go back in and add the white gel pen. But also, two, if it doesn't work the first time, let it sit, let it dry, and then go back maybe the next class period to fix something, or at least toward the end of the class period. And here, yes, we do see that line. Oh well, all I can say is that the ribbon became transparent there. And maybe this is a good opportunity to show you what I mean by hiding a mistake. So one way I could hide a mistake is hide it with black. So what if this ribbon, and here's something about form. So as we start getting into shading, if I make this darker where it goes underneath, that helps give the illusion that it goes behind. So in general, things that are farther away from you or underneath or behind, those are going to be darker. Things that you want to appear to be closer, those can be lighter. So I'm taking this from black to this middle gray to black again using stippling for the sole purpose of hiding my mistake. And so if I want to, I could actually hide this over here too. So maybe this is going to continue to have gradations. So don't think of mistakes as the end of the world. Think of them as opportunities to get creative. And oftentimes, and this will sound maybe like I'm just being overly positive, but it really is true. Sometimes those places where you made the mistake actually become the best part of the drawing because they're more creative. A lot of times the thing we have planned is something we've already seen before, or we've seen something a lot like it, but when you're forced to solve a problem, that forces out more creativity. So now I'm ready to continue to add more detail to this. So my shapes are just going to get smaller and smaller as I go. And I can use more and more overlapping. So that said, you don't have to go with crazy detail. So there's a certain point at which that detail is not going to add maybe quite as much to the design as you might hope, especially if a piece is hanging on the wall or what have you. So there is actually such a thing. It's not so much that there's too much detail, but maybe that the detail isn't worth the time that it takes. Okay, so we had a time lapse there where I was adding detail, I was inking some things, going over some things darker with the fine liner that were originally done in the ballpoint pen, adding details. So, by the way, don't worry if yours is not looking super awesome. First of all, you're working on your practice. Second of all, it's probably your very first Zentangle, and I have done a lot of these before. So that's why this is the demo. That said, I'm going to go on to the next phase. So I've done big, medium, and small shapes, and maybe some really little details like some of these dots here. And I might keep playing with those. Maybe I want some of these dots to be larger circles, what have you. But basically, I'm ready for shading. Yes, I did a little shading already, but that was sort of to cover a mistake more than anything. And the shading I'm going to start with, I want to show you that you can shade in the negative space, not just the positive space. So I'm going to shade in, I've sort of created a frame within a frame on this side, and I'm going to shade in the negative space to be dark, to be black. So first thing you need to know about shading or coloring is that you need to not fight the line. I'm going to start at an edge and I'm going to go with it. Okay? When I get to a competing edge that's going a different direction, that's where I have to be really careful. So maybe I'll just start by kind of going around all the edges of this shape. And that allows me to then go a little faster inside because I've created that buffer zone to begin with. So basically, don't fight the edges. The other thing I'll say about that is to keep your marks going in the same direction for the most part. So with this pen, it may not be as visible if I don't do that, but depending on the material, you'll see it. So sometimes you're going to have to switch directions where two edges maybe compete, but you want to do that sort of gradually, maybe sort of slowly turning your marks. And then the other thing is I want to keep my marks small. So the smaller they are, the more controlled they are. So my marks tend to be maybe 1/4 of an inch or smaller. In some of these areas, I'm going to run into competing areas of black. So this inside here should technically, maybe part of it would be black, although actually I think I gave myself an out here by making it so that maybe this frame that's white goes through here. But let's say that frame that's white only goes through like that much. If this part is supposed to be black and then I've got more black, I don't want the black to touch one another. So I left a tiny bit of white between the two areas that are black. So it can just be a tiny bit like that. How would you draw a white line on a white piece of paper? All right, let's say I wanted, here I'm just going to switch to a different drawing to make this clearer. Let's say I've got a black area over here, and I realize, oh, I've been shading this in black. Oh no, what do I do? If I want to create a white line here, I simply make it a double line, and I create a white line by shading on either side of that white line. Same idea if I want to create a white shape on a white piece of paper. I draw the shape, and then I fill in the area around it. So what if I have something over here, though, that's a black shape, and I don't want to make a white line there around it, let's say. I can also use a gradation. So over here, I want it to get to white or light gray, so I'm shading using stippling, and I make it get darker and darker by making my dots closer and closer until it goes all the way to black. So if you run into any problems with having different things that you want to be black and you realize, uh-oh, they're going to touch one another, and if I have a black shape and a black background and they touch each other, then oops, that black shape has disappeared. So that's how you prevent that, by either having it fade to white or creating that white outline or space in between. So here we are back to this. I did it in very small scale, so it was maybe hard to see, but that's what I was going for. Over here, same idea. This inner space would be black. I don't want it to compete with that ribbon, so I leave a little bit of a white border. I can have that switch over to maybe stippling, and then here, when that ribbon becomes basically white again, it can go all the way to black to finish up. And the key is to have that happen gradually so that it's not as noticeable. And I could keep playing with this, adding little tiny dots or what have you. Another type of shading you might want to add, so another type would be hatching in a context like this. Hatching might even look like a pattern. It might look like stripes. It might look like this. I might think, oops, my ribbons kind of got lost, though, in that hatching or that pattern. So I can then add cross-hatching. You might come to a point where you are fighting the edges a little bit, sometimes with cross-hatching, if you find that happening. You just need to be really careful at those edges. And I might say, you know what, that's okay, but I don't love this. I could change my mind. So I could go back in and say, you know what, I don't really like all of this being how it is. Maybe this space is just going to be black. So if you change your mind or make a mistake, you can add black. So there you see, I just changed my mind and I decided, okay, that part of that would be black. And then maybe I can say, oh, maybe I'll repeat that idea over here and make this part black as well. So in my time lapse, I filled that in, and then I want to look at it. So keep looking at your work that's part of the process. And I might think, you know what, I don't love that. We've got these sort of like in-between shapes. Maybe I'll just keep going and fill that in. Maybe I still don't like that. And that is okay. And I can fill in even more. Maybe this whole space is going to become black. So you can always make changes. And I mentioned before you can also use, let's say I like this, but it looks a little plain being all black. And notice I'm just switching my materials, so a thicker tip would make sense on the inside, but a thinner tip is then going to be better as I approach the edges. You might get some different color black inks as well, so you may find that you need to go over different places. Maybe I'll try my felt tip. So if I wanted to, let's say, add stars to this area later, my recommendation would be to let this dry first. If you do it right away, the wet black ink will mix with the wet white gel pen. But if I come back to this after it's dry, I bet I can still add some white stars on top of that. The final thing I wanted to talk about in this demo, I believe it's the final thing, adding shading with pencil. And we can add shading with pencil. It's a really nice way to say make something look more 3D. If I want to make this little blob, this little sort of round thing look more spherical, I just shade one side. I'm going to maybe make that one side also coincide with the part that goes underneath the other shape. And shade and create that spherical shape. One thing we learned is that the darker parts will look like they're going back in space. And anytime you have a curved object, whether it's a sphere or it's a cylinder, anything, my pencil cup might be a cylinder, to make this look more cylindrical or more spherical, if you shade around the edges and then let it get lighter, that will help make it look more spherical. And then do try to vary the amount of shading. So from darker, pressing harder, going over that more, to just tickling the surface. And the whole time I'm using little tiny marks. And then, so I've done a lot of the work before I even grab my blending tool. And my blending tool is just going to be my little piece of paper towel, folded and folded, not twisted, folded. Okay, it was really tiny, so I've got a little tiny point. And then I can also blend. If when you blend, so I use a 2B, and so it's a little blendier, it might spread that gray around. If your white disappears, go back in and use your eraser, because you need to have white. And that goes for the overall design as well. If you get too shading happy and most or all of your white disappears, you're going to lose your contrast. So in order to have contrast, you need the full range from black to white. So really, the most contrasty part of this really is an area like this where it's just black and white. Okay, I'm going to go down my list and see if I covered all the points I wanted to show you. We used repetition, we used some variety, we used overlapping. We didn't really talk too much about making one pattern overlap another, so I'll show you an example of that. Let's say with this butterfly kind of design, let's say I've got stripes going on over here. We'll make them curving stripes, since it's a curving shape. And I think, gosh, you know what? Those stripes are okay, but they're a little boring, or maybe I use stripes somewhere else. I can make this appear to be stripes that then overlap, let's say, polka dots. So I want to think about these stripes as 3D stripes. So it's a double line. And then I can put behind this a dot. And so that's how you can actually overlap different patterns. So maybe I have a pattern of diamonds. It could go diamond polka dot. Maybe it's a more ordered pattern. And notice I did get a little too skinny, so I'm just changing my original plan and making that a little bit bigger. But so then I can make those two patterns, what started out as stripes becomes stripes that overlap a different pattern. And so to keep that going, this next stripe would also become 3D. And that could also overlap this pattern. Let's say I get bored with this perfect pattern, so maybe now I'll change the size of my polka dots. And I can keep going with this next stripe. And again, have that overlapping some polka dots. And maybe some of those polka dots are really big. And by the way, if this looks a little funny looking or it's just a little bit hard to think through, use your pencil, and then you can make those shapes and just go back and ink the part that would be visible. And then I would go back in and I would erase the extra lines. All right, so we talked about overlapping patterns now. We talked about adding forms. So I did that mostly with the shading, but there's no reason why one of the shapes in here can't be a cube, because you know how to draw a cube. So now it's not just a shape, it's a form. I could draw a cylinder over here. I could draw a cone where it's floating in space and we see the bottom. I could draw a cone where we don't see the bottom. All right, so you can definitely, and then I could go back and I could also make that circle, since now it's the odd one out. I could add some shading on that. I could shade my cylinder, if I didn't lose too much contrast, by shading the edges and making it lighter in the center where it's coming closer to you, because that curve makes it come closer to you. So adding 3D forms, we've covered that. In my list, I talk about variety, using organic shapes and geometric shapes. I could also use different kinds of balance. So let's say I make this part of my butterfly a radial design. So all I have to do that is give it a center and then divide up that center at least 4 ways, maybe even more, and then I have the same thing happening in each of these segments. And suddenly, I've got a radial design. By the same token, you could have other parts be purposely asymmetrical and other parts be maybe just symmetrical with just kind of a line down the center. So now I've divided this in half. And as long as I do the same thing on each side, I'm going to have a symmetrical design. All right, so now we've talked about different kinds of balance and using variety. In my next part, in part 2, when we talked about shading, we added black first. I highly recommend that. You might not need any more than just solid black parts, solid white parts. That may give you all the contrast you need. We talked about starting at the edges of shapes or what have you, or spaces, and not trying to fight the line when you're adding shading. We talked about maintaining contrast, so you can create white spaces between the black spaces. We talked about maintaining contrast and not going overboard with your shading, so remember to leave some white. We talked about using shading to create form and depth, so the places that went underneath, those had a little bit of a darker shading added to them. The places that stayed on top or were closer to us, we kept lighter. And then we also talked about revising. So if I thought that this pattern was all finished, then I'm going to look at it with a little bit of a critical eye and look for any mistakes. And let's say I have a part where this poked out more than I meant it to. Well, not only can we cover things with black, we can also extend things. So maybe that's just an opportunity to add a little bit more detail right there. And next thing you know, I've got a whole new fun motif that maybe I think, hey, I liked that so much there. Maybe I'm going to add something similar over here. So look for those little mistakes and then come up with creative ways to make them look intentional. And that, I believe, is the end of our video. Happy drawing!